stories written down that he wanted to tell, and then he would embellish on them. I should have said that he would come home every day after work, and we always waited for him to come home. We always ate supper together. And just ordinary things that he would see during the day, or some of these salesmen would come in and tell him things because we were making our living on 50 cents a night. And he'd just keep us all fascinated. He was just a wonderful person, and he and I were very, very close. And I've been. Yes, I think it was Neva Craig that told me to get some tapes of my dad talking. These aren't them, but the one you just heard. But he talked about his growing up in Devil's Lake and going to his grandfather and mother's farm, Bradley Farm, and it was just fun. And he knew lots of people. He was very, very gregarious. I should have said, when I've thought often, when my dad built that little electric car, and then he and 12 other gentlemen started the Dalles Country Club, that it's too bad we could have been millionaires, because, of course, he didn't dream anybody'd ride on a golf course in an electric car, but they do now. But in starting the golf club was, then I started to play golf, and I'd come home and I'd say, "Dad, why did you put it out there?" And because it's the windiest place in the Dalles. And he'd say, "Well, there were 12 of us, and 2 of us didn't want to put it out there. Of course, we had the boat, and we knew how the wind blew." But he said, we lost out. The 2 that didn't want it wanted it around on Chenoweth Creek, because it can be blowing pretty hard on the river, and it'd still be pretty quiet over there on Chenoweth Creek. But anyway, it's been a fun life for me, and I think my dad had an awful lot of fun too. So thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your coming and hearing about my dad.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jada. Refreshments downstairs. Mosher next week. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. I just enjoyed it.
Welcome to the. Are we on? Yes, we are. Welcome to the 2005 installment of the Regional History Forum. We've been doing this for many years now, 27, I think. We added it up, and we have a large collection of materials that speakers have presented, and it's been, I think, a good addition, really, to the conversation here over the years. Many of you here in the audience have given programs, and it really all adds to the ongoing collection of historical data that we all share and we all appreciate here. This year's program is interesting in a couple of ways. As we talked about the programs, we have depended quite heavily on the Oregon Council for the Humanities and their programs some other years. But last year they ran out of money, so we had to lean back on our own devices. And this year, so that really stimulated some thought about local programs, things of interest that we might put on our program. And so this year, actually all the programs are locally generated. Some of them will be some of the other communities in Wasco County, early Mosher Show and Tell, next week with Willis Golston. The week after that, early Duffer, the Duffer family. Sandy Bissett is here, and you can corner her and ask her what she's going to be doing with that program. And Sam Woolsey will be doing the last one. And but before I make the introductions, just a couple couple things, not apologies, I guess, but just of information. Paul Tooze is the one who should be up here doing the preliminary introductions because he is the president of the original Courthouse Corporation. Paul is traveling down in Arizona, so he is not here today. He should be back in time for the last of the programs. The other thing is we had talked to Everett Metzentine about doing one of the programs. Those of you who know Everett well know that he's been in the hospital. Some of you may have seen that in the paper. He is now at Columbia Basin, and he sends his greetings, and he's sorry that he couldn't do his program, but sends greetings to all of you. Jan brought her newspaper along. Where are you, Jan? Yeah. Thank you, because on the front page of the paper we have a local celebrity who's actually with us today, Jackie. Jackie is the archaeologist sifting artifacts on the front page of the Oregonian today, so there's interesting stories to tell there too, and we're going to maybe sign you up for next year's program and tell us all about the Lewis and Clark things and the old things at the mouth of the river that you're finding. Well, on to today's program. It was my great pleasure to come to the Dalles while Hal Fancher was still alive. He was a little bit out of circulation at that point, but not a whole lot out of circulation because he still loved to tell stories and did that every chance he got. He would come to church and had a kind of a reserved place, a place of honor over on the one side. You always knew Hal would be sitting there. And when he couldn't come to the church anymore, there were still visits, and even though his eyesight was failing in those years, his memory was keen and his ability to tell stories was just phenomenal. We have his daughter, Jada Gay, who grew up hearing those stories and is a part of some of them, I understand. She will show you some of the pictures and other historical records that she brings along. So let's welcome Jada to tell about her dad, Hal Fancher, remembering Hal Fancher.
Now, does this work?
It should, but they will tell you in the back of the room if they can't hear you. And we'll use this one.
Ah. I'm not a public speaker like my dad was, but I'll do the... You can't hear it. I've got a mic right here somewhere. Oh.
Did you turn it on?
Is it on? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? All right. I could probably just not use this thing.
You can turn it up. Turn it up a little bit, but not a whole lot.
Can you hear me now? All right. I'm here to talk about my dad. His name was Harlan Ross Fancher, but better known as Hal. And he was born in 1887 in Devil's Lake, North Dakota. He died in 1982. He was just 2 months short of being 95. He graduated in high school from Devil's Lake. There were 9 in his class, and he was 16 years old when he graduated. And at that time, then his parents moved to Minneapolis, and he went along with them, of course. And I think he worked for a couple of years. Well, I know he did. And then he went to the University of Minnesota. He majored in English. He was very articulate, and maybe that's one of the reasons that he was that way. But he was a very gregarious person. He loved life, and he was always interested in everything that went on around him, and I think that kept him young for years, no matter what his chronological age was. In the years when he went 2 years to the University of Minnesota, and then his father, who was a superintendent of schools, got the Come West bug, and so he got a job as superintendent of schools in Sumter, Oregon. That was a big roaring town then. They found gold, and it was quite a little city. It did burn down. Dad said it really burned really well because they had wooden sidewalks. But he wasn't there at the time. But anyway, he came west with his family. And that summer, then he worked on a smelter, the gold smelter. The gold smelters, I forget what they call those. Yeah, well, anyway, they were mechanical, and they just went through that country and really sort of ruined it, looking for gold. Dredges, that's the word I needed. Well, he worked there that summer, and then I'm supposed to only talk about my dad, but I have to tell you that's where he met my mother, in Sumter. And she was, the superintendents then also taught school, so she was one of my granddad's students. She's a real cute little girl, about 16 years old. And that's when Dad first met her, because they went to the same church. And then my dad, he saw that part of the West, and he decided to go farther down in the Willamette Valley. So, of course, you went on the train. And he got us, those days, some of you probably still remember this, I do anyway, when the trains went through town, they stopped. And everybody got off the train, all the passengers got off while they were unloading the baggage, and everybody walked around, well, my dad being the gregarious kind of person, and so fascinated and interested in automobiles. And he saw he was going to go to Medford, but he got off the train at Roseburg and was walking around the train platform, and he saw a great big limousine, and he was looking it over, front and back and everything, and this gentleman came up to him and he said, "Do you like this car?" And my dad said, "Well, I'm just admiring it." And he said, "Well, where are you going?" And the man said, my dad said, I'm going to Medford." And this man said, "Well, what are you going to do down there?" My dad said, "Well, I don't know yet." So this man said, I can't think of his name right now, but he said, "Would you like to be a chauffeur?" My dad got on the train, went in and got his baggage, and came back out. And so that's how he got to Roseburg. And he was there 5 years. And he had the first automobile garage in Roseburg. And he was also the fire chief. And a friend of ours years ago said, my dad was quite a good-looking man, and he was the Beau Brummel of the town. Well, later on, and after he started the first garage down there, he went once a year up to visit the Gardner family. My mother was the oldest of 8 children. By now, they had moved from Sumter to Baker. So that was a long trip, from Roseburg to Baker. So they saw each other once a year. I think they wrote a lot of letters. But anyway, he got an offer to come up to the Dalles in 1914. And he went to work for the Walter Williams Company. And they had built a big new shop, and it's where the Dalles Chronicle is now. And he was the shop foreman there. Well, as it happened, they built brick buildings, and it wasn't supposed to burn down, but it did. And so then he had his own shop for about 3 years, And then he went into partnership with a fellow named Bert Shelley. Some of you might remember him. And they incorporated the Dow's Garage Company. And that is where Napa Auto is now. And he worked there for 14 years with Mr. Shelley. But Mr. Shelley, he sold cars. My dad ran the business, and Mr. Shelley was a salesman. Well, then they got dealerships, if you can imagine, in those days, one in Bend and one in Klamath Falls. So Mr. Shelley was gone a lot. And also, he was sort of a womanizer. And my mother always felt so sorry for Mrs. Shelley. But anyway, they had that garage there, and then I don't know whether they went broke or what. I just was not very big. In fact, I wasn't even born for part of the time they were there. But then he bought, Paul McCoy used to have a garage. Now, Gene Atkinson can back me up here. And it was two doors east of the Dow's Garage Company. It's where Atkinson Motor used to be, and now it's Jerry Jeffries started a, whatever you call it, mall. And that used to be my dad's garage. And my dad went there in 1931, and we had Fancher Motor Company then. And I used to spend a lot of time down there because my mother was a professional music teacher and couldn't make any noise or play around at home because she taught in our living room. So I'd get on my bike and go down and visit my dad. So he and I were very, very close friends. Anyway, after, I think he had the Fancher Motor Company until about 1946. And he had Gene Atkinson's brother in there selling cars. And then Gene Atkinson came home from the service about the same time my dad had a sort of a heart attack. I was in college, so I don't remember how much he was affected. But they told him he couldn't lift anything heavier than a pencil. So he went to work for the Oregon Employment Service with Eck Rorick, if any of you remember him. And so he worked there until he was 70, and then the state had some kind of a rule that you had to retire. So he retired, and then he was the bailiff. Judge Wilkinson asked him if he'd like to be the bailiff. He was the bailiff until he was 88 years old. From all these different things that my dad did, he would come home and tell stories. At the dinner table, everybody was just fascinated because he could see something that some people wouldn't even notice, and he could make a story out of it. And he was a wonderful storyteller. I think I know most of his stories by heart. It was during the Depression days that I remember Dad telling how he had to make a deposit. That was probably when he was in the Dow's Garage Company. And he had to make a deposit in the U.S. Bank. And at that time, the U.S. Bank was in the U.S. Bank building, which was a 5-story building where the Washington, what is the name of that? Mutual Savings is. And all the doctors were in that building, and all the dentists. And anyway, the lower floor then was the bank. And Dad went in there, and they were closed. It was just a little after 3. They closed at 3. So he rattled the cages and said, "Oh, hell. Okay, we'll take your deposit." And he was so mad. He didn't know about the 28th. You know, when the stock market fell, and all the banks closed. They closed the next day. His money was gone. Now, anyway, so that was one of the things that he was always mad. He was also mad at the city attorney once because we had a house at 212 West 9th, just down from where the Dick's house is. And my dad was buying that house for $1,500. And he couldn't make some of the payments. So we got kicked out of that house. It was pretty traumatic for the kids, you know. So we had to move, and we moved down to 402 West 7th. It was a rental house. And Mr. Wagilt, Gus Wagilt, he had a big house on Pentland and 7th. Some of you might know that. And then going west, he built every house in that block. So we were able to rent that house. And it wasn't much fun for me because I still went to Court Street School, which was fine, but I was a real tomboy and outdoors all the time. He didn't want you to hit tennis balls against the house. You couldn't play Annie over because you might, and we happened to live right next to the Wagilts, so I couldn't do any of those things that I liked to do. But anyway, in the so he came in here in 1940, and 14, excuse me, and he worked for the employment office then, and then he was the bailiff. I remember during the Depression a lot because we didn't have much money, but we never missed a meal. But Dad would come home, somebody would come in and they didn't have any money, so they'd give him a sack of potatoes or some live chickens. First time I ever saw a chicken, you know, run around with their head cut off. And he had a .22 rifle that he took in, and I still have that. One of our favorite things that I used to do with my dad was to go down on our boat. I don't know if I can walk. Can you hear me now? Mm-hmm. Okay. My dad built this boat, and we would go out on the Columbia River. This is a picture of when it was being built. He and his mechanic built this boat. It had a big 8 Studebaker engine in it. And this was an old lifeboat from World War I, the hull. And so they went down and got that and brought it back. And this is right behind where the Dow's Garage Company was. And this is a colored picture of it. And of course, he named it Jocelyn. There's another picture of him working on the back end of the boat, if anybody wants to look at these. That's my name, Jocelyn. And I asked my dad often, why am I Jada, not Jocelyn? And the only time anybody ever called me Jocelyn was my mother when she was mad sometimes. And he said, well, people would ask you what your name was when you were about 2 years old, and that's sort of what came out. Then that was that song, you know, Jada, Jada. This is a picture of my dad when he was young. And this is a picture of my mom and dad when they were married up in Baker, in front of their fireplace. And this is a picture of them on their 50th wedding anniversary. My dad was so mechanical, besides building a boat, he built this little car. I don't know if you remember that, Gene? And bicycle wheels, and it ran with a starter engine and with a battery. So we used to take it in parades sometimes. I did.
Is that you in the car?
No, that's my older brother and my brother Brad, who went to high school with Gene and Dick Bailey. And here's a picture of me and my dad in a parade, one of the parades. He has a derby on, and I have a little carousel, and I was 10 years old then. And the reason we have all these cars, the American Legion, I don't know where they are now, but they own all these cars. And this is a 1902 Studebaker, and it run it ran by battery also. They used to keep all these cars in the basement of our garage, Fancher Motor Company. So every year before a parade, my dad would be down there getting them ready to go. And this car had, the fenders were made out of leather. Real interesting. Huh. And then this is another picture of my two brothers in that car my dad made.
Is that still around?
And no, it isn't now. And this is a car that my dad made. He called it Big Bill. He made this car. This is absolutely amazing, and the things that he could do. And he had a memory that didn't stop. He could remember. That's all right. He could remember everything, I swear. So he was a real fun dad. He talked about when he went to the employment service, and people would come in and be interviewed for employment, and then he'd come home. He says, "Oh, you can't imagine who came in today." I said, "Well, who?" Pearl Button. And he'd just see the things that were just comical. And then another one was Velvet Hyde. The parents weren't nice. In the 1920s, my father was one of 12 men that started the Dalles Country Club. So I sort of grew up at the country club, but I didn't start playing golf till I was 10. And I made sure I played every year when I was having 5 children, so I didn't want to break my record. So as of today, I have played golf for 70 years. And I'm still playing. Not as good as I used to, but anyway, I'm going to keep playing as long as I can. One of the stories that Dad told, and probably John Lundell is going to maybe correct me on this, or maybe if Marilyn was here, was when he came here, he said there were a lot of Chinamen here. And there was Chinatown down on 1st Street between Court Street and Union Street. I remember and then there, when we were growing up too, there was also the Glenwood Hotel. Anyway, I know my mother said whenever they went to Portland, they went on the train, of course, and the train would stop here at the Dalles, and she'd look out at Chinatown, and she'd say, "Oh, I wouldn't ever want to live here." But she did since 1914. But anyway, Dad said that this one story I remember him telling about in Chinatown. Up from China, at 1st Street then, there was the First National Bank was where the Britain's shoe store is now. And some of the Chinamen dug a tunnel from 1st Street, and then they would have had to go under the alley. So it was pretty big digging. And then they came up in the vault at the bank. And they thought that would be a good way to get rich quick, kind of thing. But that had to take a lot of digging. And they had it figured out. They knew exactly where the vault was. And vaults then were just made out of bricks and mortar. And so they got a lot of money, and it must have been heavy because they didn't have paper money then. It was all coins. And so anyway, I guess the next day, as Dad told the story, there was a Chinaman that was over on where they sent out freight. And they were, somehow the policeman, the sheriff, and everybody were informed about this one fellow that just kept walking back and forth, and because he wanted to send his money to San Francisco. And so they came down and they arrested him and opened it up, and it was just chock full. Whoever helped him dig the tunnels, they never did know, so they didn't get them. But he ended up in the penitentiary. So anyway, of course there were lots of Chinamen that were out at Suford's Cannery. I worked at Suford's Cannery, and they did all the getting the fish ready to go into the cans. And it was amazing. It was to watch them. Boy, they could just do that so quickly. The only other story that I would tell now, well, I can tell this one story because it's a good one. My dad said he didn't say, there was a gentleman here named Binks. That was not his real name, Binks Burgett. And when Dad would tell a story about Binks Burgett, Binks stuttered. My dad was such a good storyteller because he would stutter. He'd say, Binks, Anyway, Binks Burgett was the undertaker and the coroner, both. And some of the firemen who lived in the firehouse, about where the old firehouse was on 3rd Street, would walk up the street and go into Binks's undertaking parlor, and he let them do this, and they would play cards. Well, this one night, they had a hot card game going there, but they also had some bootlegger liquor. And this one fellow got a little bit too much, and he sort of maybe passed out. So when the game was over and the other fellows were going to leave, they thought, let's put him in the coffin. You may have heard this story. So they did. And when he woke up, he thought maybe he had died. They put some imitation flowers on his chest. And he woke up and he said, I don't think I'm dead, but here I've got these flowers on me, but why do I have to go to the bathroom? Anyway, that was one of our favorites. He had quite a few about Binks Burgett. And one of them was that Binks never stuttered when he was talking long distance, because he told my dad it cost too much money. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or can fill in anything that you want to know about? Yes.
Are you related to Burr Fancher?
Burr.
Yes.
I've never heard of Burr Fancher. Where does he live?
He's a professor retired in Albany.
Oh.
He's, similar to your dad, so he was raised in Arkansas and also in Oregon.
No. My dad was raised in North Dakota, and then they moved to Minneapolis. There aren't very many Fanchers. It's sort of a different name. Then I married some doctor named Gay, and that's a tough name to live with, too, especially for my sons. But anyway, I was the baby of the family. I had 2 older brothers, Hal and Brad, and they're both still alive. One lives in Bend, and Brad lives down in Vancouver. They both did live in Bend, but my brother Brad moved to Vancouver. I think that's all I'm going to tell you right now, but I'd like to have you listen to a tape. Oh, okay. Gene? They're probably related. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's right, Gene.
One of them was a judge.
Jada, didn't your dad and Brad build didn't Brad enter a soapbox derby or something? Do you know anything about that?
I'm sure I would have. My memory's almost as good as my dad's.
Well, as I remembered, I think there was
They might
some
have.
kind of a race or tournament or something like that,
Might
where
be.
they had these soapbox deals, and anyway, Brad won the soapbox tournament.
Good. Good. Do you remember that, Dick?
No, I don't.
I don't remember that.
Jocelyn in White Cemetery early on. Is there any connection there?
No, because their name was spelled J-O-S.
Oh,
My name is Jocelyn. And a funny thing is when I got to be 21 years old, I went down to the courthouse to get my birth certificate. Because I was in college, you know, it'd be sort of nice to be legal. And I got it, and it didn't say my name on it. It says Baby Girl Fancher. So I went home and I said to my mom, why didn't I have a name? And she said, well, you didn't have a name for about 3 or 4 months. And I said, why is that? Well, we kept going back and forth, and I was so special. And then they picked Jocelyn. But I've been Jada for a long, long time. And I appreciate your listening and enjoying about my dad. If I could have talked about somebody besides him, I could probably go on for a long time. But listen to this tape. Oh, I forgot to say, though, I should preface the tape by saying my dad was such a good storyteller that the service clubs wanted him to be a guest speaker many, many times. And usually he talked about automobile things, but not always. And this is one that I had from a fellow gave it to me. Well, I don't know what year it was. And it was, he was talking at the Lions Club for their noon luncheon. And actually, I had my dad make some tapes of when he grew up and that sort of thing. But he could just sit down and his memory was phenomenal. But anyway, this is a tape from one of his Lions Club speeches. And I think you'll enjoy it.
In order to clear the atmosphere a little bit, as far as I'm concerned, I'd like to know how many of you fellows have heard me talk about antique cars. Well, I'll make you a proposition. All you fellows that raised your hands are perfectly welcome to leave if you do it quietly, and you won't have to listen to this again. Nobody going? Well, okay. The year was 1903. Men wore derby hats and high-button shoes, and the women wore bustles and corsets and high-button shoes. To prove it, I've still got the button hook on my key ring that I used to use on both the men and the women. That was the year that 2 young upstarts down in Dayton, Ohio, built an airplane, and people said they had actually flown it for a half a mile. And that was the year that a fellow named Marconi sent a telegram across the English Channel without using any wires, and nobody believed that either. Well, anyway, my father was county superintendent of schools of a big, flat county in northeastern North Dakota. We were sitting at the table one night eating supper. That was in the days when we had breakfast, dinner, and supper. And he said, Harlan, that's my name, we're going to have to do something about that little driving team. We had a team that he used to go around in the county and visit the 60-odd country schools that were in the Ramsey County school system at that time. And I said, well, what's the trouble? He said, well, the veterinarian says that Nell, the little mare, has got an incurable spavin, hoof trouble. And he said, I've just got a good idea to sell the team and buy an automobile. I was 16 years old, and I pretty near fell out of my chair. I was so excited about it. There were 2 automobiles in this town, Devil's Lake at that time. It's a town of about 2,000 people. One was a 7-horsepower curved dash Oldsmobile, and the other was a 4-horsepower Stanley steamer. We didn't have sales agencies in those days, of course. The only way we got any information about automobiles was to read the ads in the Saturday Evening Post and Muncie's Magazine and McClure's Magazine. We looked all through them, and between the 2 of us, we came up with an ad covering the Orient buckboard, which was manufactured in Waltham, Massachusetts, by the Waltham Manufacturing Company. It was a flat buckboard, no body at all, just a pair of hickory reaches with cross slats, 26 by 2.5 wire wheels, a 4-horsepower air-cooled motor mounted on the back axle, which wasn't very much bigger than the motors that they use nowadays on these lawnmowers. It was guaranteed to run 25 miles an hour, and it had no reverse. If you got into a tight spot, you just got up and lifted it around because it only weighed 350 pounds. And it had 1 speed ahead. And it sold for $500. Well, my dad decided that that was the car for us. North Dakota was flat and didn't have many hills, and he didn't know what the difference was between having high and low speed anyway. When they said 1 speed, that was all right. So he went down to the bank and got a draft for $500. They didn't have any partial payments or time payments or trade-ins or anything of that kind. You had the money or else you didn't get the car. And he sent the draft to Waltham, Massachusetts. And that was the longest 3 weeks, I think, that I ever put in waiting for that Orient buckboard to show up. But it finally arrived at the depot, and in the meantime, they had sent us a flock of catalogs and instruction books, and also through an agency for the whole state of North Dakota. Anyhow, the drayman brought the crated car up and dumped it in our backyard. The wheels were off, and the fenders, which were made of plywood, were off, and that was about all you could take off. And then it was boxed up in a great big crate of 2x4s. In fact, there were almost enough 2x4s in that crate to make the framework for the garage that I built to put the car in. Well, they dumped it in the backyard. Our backyard was all fenced except for a 10-foot gateway into the alley between our barn and the neighbor's barn. And we knocked the crate apart, and neighbors gathered from all around. The word got out quickly that the Fancher's automobile had come. And my brother went down to the nearest hardware store to get gasoline. That was the only place you could buy gasoline in those days, in hardware stores. The tank held 5 gallons. And my dad and I had both read the instruction book thoroughly. It told how you started the motor. You put your foot on the rear axle and pulled up on a strap with a spade handle, just like starting one of these lawnmower deals. But you always had to be sure and put your foot on the rear axle, because if you didn't, the compression was so strong that you lifted the whole darn thing right off the ground when you lifted up. So we got it all ready to go, cranked it, made a noise like a Gatling gun. Everybody in the neighborhood that wasn't there already came running. My father and I got in. He forgot all about the instruction book telling about letting the clutch in gently. He put his big foot right flat down on the accelerator and shoved the lever ahead. We left that vicinity immediately. He managed to hit the opening between the two barns. Luckily, the gate was open. We jumped over a big pile of ashes and lit right in the middle of a tall bunch of Jimson weeds. We both got out. Neither one of us said a word, but right at that minute, I was promoted to be the chief engineer of the Orient Buckboard. And it's a fact that although my father lived to be an old man, he never again tried to drive an automobile. That 100-yard dash into the weeds finished him. Well, as I say, he bought it to visit country schools. And the country schools in North Dakota in those days ran in the summertime. They didn't dare send the children out on those bleak prairies in the wintertime with an unexpected blizzard swooping down on you. So that was fine for me. I didn't go to school. I went to school in town, of course, and they had the school in the wintertime there, vacation all summer, and so I was the chief chauffeur and did all the driving for him around through the county. And this little buckboard made an awful lot of noise, and nobody up there in the backwoods had ever seen a car, or only a few, and very, very few people had ever ridden in one. And the teacher and the pupils would hear us coming a long ways off on the prairie, and when we'd get to the schoolhouse, the whole school would be outside waiting to watch us come up, and then they'd dismiss the school after Dad had had his visit so they could all watch us take off and go away. I had a special friend, a young lady, my age and my class in school, and I invited her to go for a ride one day in the Orient Buckboard, and in those days my invitations were never declined. So we started out. It was a beautiful afternoon in the fall of 1903, and we hadn't gone very far along this winding country road until we flushed a big covey of North Dakota prairie chickens. Some of them flew off to the right, and some of them flew off to the left, and one benighted chicken flew right straight down the road ahead of us at an altitude of about 6 feet. And that's what happened. All of a sudden, there was a great big gob of manure that flew back from the prairie chicken, and it hit my girl right under the chin. We stopped. I didn't have anything handy to use for a cleanup except a chunk of oily waste in the toolbox. And man, that just made stuff worse. She had on a thin white blouse. They called them peekaboo blouses in those days, and boy, it was a mess. Neither one of us said a word. You know, at 16, things can be awfully tragic that are really funny afterwards. I turned the car around, and we drove back home. She got out and walked into the house. About a week after that, she was sent by her parents to a finishing school, girls' finishing school, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And my parents, my dad's term of office ran out, and we moved to Minneapolis. And what I started to say when I started that sentence was that to this very day, I have never seen or heard from that girl. That prairie chicken didn't know it, but it sure nipped that romance in the bud. As I say, shortly after that, we moved to Minneapolis. Excuse me. I enrolled in the University of Minnesota and got a job in my spare time working in a little factory that had just been started, building an automobile called the Wolf. It was a 4-cylinder, 16 horsepower machine, and one of the things they advertised was that it had 16 inches of clearance under the rear axle. The roads in those days, the country roads, were just a pair of ruts, and the center of the road was high up, and sometimes there'd be a rock in it because all they had was these high-wheeled buggies and wagons and plenty of clearance. And the cars came out with just a little bit of clearance, and they were stuck. They couldn't go on these roads. So the Wolf people made a great to-do of advertising that they had 16 inches of clearance. So the first year, they built 25 cars. And I ran a lathe, turned out hubcaps and radiator caps and gasoline tank caps, and then they promoted me to helping with the assembly. The second year I was there, that was just during summer vacations and after school and weekends, they doubled their production. They produced 50 cars. But then the floater cars began coming out of Detroit, and they went under. Shortly after that, we moved to Oregon. I was a junior in University of Minnesota, and I came along for the ride just to see the fun. And I landed in Roseburg and ended up as private chauffeur for a millionaire down there who had a 40 horsepower, 4-cylinder Thomas Flyer. And that was the only 4-cylinder car in Roseburg. There were only about 12 cars there. And shortly after I came there, I joined the fire department, and a year or so later, I became chief of the fire department in Roseburg. Well, we had nothing but hand-pulled hose carts and one hook and ladder truck that we had a standing offer of $5 to any drayman that would get there when the fire siren blew to haul the hook and ladder truck to the fire. And when that siren blew, Main Street in Roseburg looked like a Roman chariot race with all the draymen licking their horses to get there for the $5. Well, we persuaded the city fathers that it was high time to have a motorized fire engine. Medford had one, and Eugene had one, and there was no reason why Roseburg shouldn't have one. So they agreed, and we got a combination hook and ladder and hose truck mounted on a Model T Ford chassis. That was, they were building Model Ts by that time in those days. But the big trouble was tires. Every time you went out, you had tire trouble.
Hal, what year was it?
That, when I went to Roseburg, was in 1909. And there were a couple of fellows had invented some stuff called S&K that was supposed to cure all the pneumatic tire trouble and prevent punctures and blowouts. And the stuff was a kind of molasses and glue or sponge rubber affair, and they made it in long strips, the correct size diameter for the inside of the tire, and you took the tire off the rim, cut off this length of S&K, laid it around inside the tire, put the tire back on the rim, and that stuff acted instead of having an inner tube with air in it. And, of course, no more punctures. So they had the wheels equipped with S&K. They delivered the truck, and we fellows in the fire department all practiced starting it. Of course, everything was hand starting in those days. They had never invented self-starters yet in that time. And the idea was that, of course, that the first man that got to the station after the fire siren blew down on the roundhouse was the boy that climbed up and drove it to the fire. So it sat there on the floor for a couple of weeks in the hot August weather down there in Roseburg, and finally the fire whistle blew, and everybody headed for the barn. I was one of the first ones to get there, but I didn't get into the driver's seat. He pulled out just before I got to the station. And I saw immediately that we were in for deep trouble, because in the 2 weeks that the car had sat there, the underside of each wheel had flattened out a space about that long. Every time the wheel turned over, the flat spot hit the ground, and the car jumped up in the air. And the faster the truck went, the higher it jumped. The first block, the ladders all fell off. The second block, the hose fell off, and by the third block, all the firemen had fallen off. We never did get to that fire. Some neighbor put it out with a garden hose. But we had a couple of clever fellows in the department who were machinists at the roundhouse, and they built a couple of big hydraulic jacks, installed them on the floor of the fire department hall, and when you pull the valve and let the water into these hydraulic jacks, the plungers would come up and lift the fire truck about 3 inches off the floor, and there it would stand until next fire alarm, and the first fellow in then would pull the valve, let the water out, the fire truck would settle gently on the floor, and everything was all right. It was fine and dandy. Well, shortly after that, I heard about a big garage that was being built in the Dalles. I had a sweetheart who lived over in Baker, and I figured that that would cut half of the traveling time if I'd moved from Roseburg to the Dalles, and I'd have more chance to go over and visit her. So I came up here in January of 1914, that's 62 years ago, and applied for a job with this big company, Walther Williams, who were just going into the automobile business. They had previously been heavy hardware, shelf and heavy hardware they called it, and also dealt in farm machinery of all sorts. And they were in that building where Meyer and Cryer have their office now. They had that whole lower floor. And they also had a big tin warehouse that they kept full of farm equipment out where Payless Drug is now. They were building this new garage on that parking lot that is in front of the Coast to Coast Hardware. That was a fine brick garage, supposed to be fireproof, but it wasn't. Well, anyway, I got off the train and I met Mr. W.E. Walther. That's Harry Jr.'s grandfather, and it ended up with my getting the job as service manager for the garage, which would be ready for occupancy in April. And on April 6th, they had a grand opening and started out. Now, they had the agency for 8 different makes of cars. The Auburn and the Apperson and the Chalmers and the Cadillac, the Ford and the Franklin, the Merriam and the Overland. That's 8. And of course, the stories that were the funniest to me in those days were the things that happened to the Model Ts, mostly because there were more of them than anything else. Am I running short here on time? And we had a very prominent firm of doctors in those days, Ryder, Thompson, and Coburth. Ryder was an older man, but Coburth and Thompson were younger. And when Dr. Coburth graduated from medical school and moved here, his grandfather gave him a Model T Ford Roadster for a graduation present, and he was very proud of it. These cars in those days didn't have any windshield. They cost extra. And of course, they weren't closed cars at all. There were no sedans or coupes. They all had folding tops. And the lights were acetylene. They had an acetylene generator on the running board. You filled the bottom half of it with carbide and the top half of it with water. And when you were driving along and it got too dark and you wanted to have your lights on, you stopped, got out, opened the valve that let the water begin to dip into the carbide, waited for 5 minutes for the generated gas to run up through the copper and rubber tubing to the headlights, went around in front, struck a match on the seat of your pants, and lit your lights. And if the lights were in good working order and the reflectors were polished, you could see pretty well, about down to the end of this table, but from then on, you were a total loss. Well, one night, Dr. Kober got an emergency call. There was an injured man out on the Duffer Road. It was in the fall, wheat hauling time, and of course there was no paving, there was no gravel. And there were big wheat wagons, 6 and 8 horse teams, hauling in grain to the Wasco warehouse mill up here and to the storage sheds, just cut the road all to pieces. And from fence to fence, it was just a series of thank you moms and heavy dust and no place to go except just plow down the middle of it. Well, he started out and hit this section of the road, and as he was sailing along as fast as he could in his Model T, he hit a bump. And he thought that must be a sack of grain that's fallen off of somebody's truck. They sacked all the grain in those days and brought it in great piles of sacked grain on their horse-drawn wagons. So he stepped on the reverse pedal and backed up, and bang, he hit it again. He got out, and he really saw by that time that he had run over his pavement. Not only once, but twice, going and coming. Well, it happened to be a thoroughly inebriated Indian, and it didn't do him very much damage. Dr. Kober finally got him loaded into the Model T and took him back to, dumped him off at the hospital and told him to clean him up and put him to bed. The next morning he came down there to check up, and the nurses said, well, during the night some of his friends came and got him, and they gave him his clothes and took him away. And I don't know if Doc ever collected on that service call or not, but at any rate it didn't hurt the man much. About that same time, I got a call one night for a wreck. We had a well-equipped wrecker with a hoist and a boom to lift stuff. And it was out on 15 Mile. So I went out there, and it was a group of Indians. There were 2 Indian men and 1 Indian woman sitting on the bank of the creek, and right in the middle of the creek, upside down, was this Model T. So my helper and I hooked onto it, hauled it ashore, and tipped it right side up, cleared off the remains of the top, which was a total wreck, and threw it back in the creek. There weren't any lure bugs in those days. And checked the oil and filled it with gasoline. We had an extra tank along with us. And I said to the Indian man, start her up and load your wife in, and we'll follow you into town and do some more repairing so you can get back home. And he looked at me kind of disgusted, and he said, she's no good, her leg's broke. And it was. She'd sat there on the bank all the time with a broken leg and never said anything about it at all. But we got her loaded in and got her back to town. There was a character who lived out on the route to Duffer by the name of Pete Godfrey. Some of you may remember that name. He hated automobiles. In fact, he carried a shotgun around with him, loaded with pepper and salt, and threatened openly and broadly that he would shoot the first blankety-blank car driver that ever ran him off the road with his team. But he finally softened up and bought a Model T. But he had a lot of trouble. He was a little fellow, and in those days, of course, the Model Ts were all hand crank. And on a cold day, sometimes you had a heck of a time getting them started. You had to spin them, and he couldn't spin his. One day he was fighting with it out there, and it was a cold, snappy morning, and happened to look, and a big manure pile out behind the barn was vaporizing. He could see the steam coming off of it, and he had a bright idea. He hitched up his team of horses and he went to town and got a load of 2x8s, and he built a ramp right up to the top of the manure pile, and with a flat place on top. And when he would come in with a Ford, good and hot, he would back it up the ramp and set it on top of the manure pile and cover it with a tarpaulin, and the heat coming up kept it nice and warm. So in the morning, when he'd want to go out, he'd just get somebody to put him off the ramp while he sat in the driver's seat, and by the time he got to the bottom of the ramp, the thing was running. And he was a good customer of ours, but I often used to laugh because the fellows, when he came in, hated to work on his car. They couldn't tell whether Pete Godfrey smelled the worst or whether the Ford did. And the funny thing about that was that he drove it for several years, and then he went off the bank one day in an accident, turned a somersault, and the car came down on top of him and killed him. That was really something for the book, to have a person end up that way that had hated them so. I've got to look at my list here a little and see how near through I am. We had a very famous Catholic priest in town by the name of Father Brownsgeest, a little Belgian with a pointed beard. He's responsible for the old St. Peter's Church down here. And he was a real automobile fan. We were going down with him one day on the Bailey Glatzert to buy a new Overland. That was when I was working for Walter Williams. And got down there and started walking up Burnside Street. Even in those days, they had lots of agencies up on Burnside Street. And as we walked by this row of plate glass windows and shiny cars, he saw one inside that really took his fancy. It was an Apperson Jackrabbit, car built for gentlemen sportsmen. And on the front of the radiator, I had a big nickel-plated Jackrabbit. That was where it got its name. And he was utterly fascinated by this Jackrabbit. And nothing would do but he would have that, and he didn't want the Overland at all. So he came home on the Bailey Glatzert. We saw this car half off the road, tipped over sideways, and I said to my wife, that looks like Father Brownsgeest in the Apperson. And sure enough, it was. He was standing in the road there, and he saw me, and he rushed up, and he said, Mr. Fancher, just the man I want to see. And I said, well, Father, what happened here? What happened? Well, he said, let me tell you, I was going along here just as nice as you please, and I took my hands off the steering gear just for a minute to light my cigar, and here I am. So we cut a length of barbed wire off the bottom string of Walter Flint's fence and hauled him back on, and he was all right. After I had worked for Walter Williams a while, I got in with a group of fellows who built a new modern garage down on the corner diagonally across from the post office where the General Tool Company is now. And for 13 years I was head of that garage. Called it the Dow's Garage Company. And we did a heavy business in overnight storage. The cars were all open cars, you know, and they didn't have any trunks. You carried stuff on the running board, and people didn't like to leave their cars outdoors. So the people that stayed at the Hotel Dow's down the next block, and at the Hotel Albert up in the other block, used to leave the cars there overnight with us. We had a 24-hour service, nightman, and for 50 cents a night, we would store your car, wash your windshield, check your tires, and if you were a commercial man, a traveler, we did it for 35 cents. So every night the car or the garage would be full of these storage cars, and of course they wanted to get out early in the morning, and there was a lot of congestion, and so I made it a habit of going down to work about 6:30 every morning to help the nightman, who stayed on till 8 o'clock, get tourists started on their way. I had a night man, his first name was Bob, and he was an awfully good, reliable man, but sometimes he was a little bit slow on the uptake, and so I like to be there to help give people word information and do whatever we could to get them started. I had a sidewalk gasoline pump. It didn't have any service stations or drive-in places at all in those days. The gasoline pumps were all out on the edge of the curb. And this pump was at the edge of the curb, and a little farther down the street toward the post office was an air stand with a long stretch of flexible hose to dust out cars and pump up tires. And one morning, I was busy checking a customer's tires there at the air stand, and a lady drove up and stopped at the pump. And Bob went out to wait on her. And I could see out of the corner of my eye him talking to her and shaking his head, and she drove on down past me. And I thought for a second that probably she asked him for road directions and he hadn't told her what she wanted to know, so I flagged her as she went by. And I said, I noticed you stopped and talking to my man a minute ago, madam. Is there anything I can do to help you? She said, well, I don't know whether there is or not. She was really grumpy. I said, well, what's the trouble? She said, well, I asked your man back there if you had a restroom, but I don't think he understands good English. I said, well, we certainly do have one, and you're welcome to use it. So she drove down and parked and came back, and after she had gone, I got to wondering what she and Bob had said to each other that had made her so perturbed. So the first chance I had, I called Bob over and I said, you remember that woman that stopped at the pump a few minutes ago and you talked to her? Yeah, I remember her. Well, what did you say to her? What made her mad? He said, I don't know. She just drove up there and she said, have you got a whip broom? And I said, no, I haven't, but if you would drive on down to the air stand, I'll blow it out for you. Well, I can see it's time to quit, but I got to tell you one more story. E.O. McCoy was a prominent man here in town, and he had a four-cylinder locomobile. And he and his wife went over to Honolulu one Christmas. In those days, cars overheated. They ran hot. The radiators weren't efficient, and the fans weren't efficient, and they just ran too hot. And when he came back from Honolulu, he had a sign painter. This was an open car, a Baby Tano locomobile. He had the sign painter paint a sign on each rear door, Mauna Loa, the name of the volcano, because he said it was a fact that his locomobile could throw hot water and steam higher than Mauna Loa could. So he put the name on it. Well, we had a famous old Italian stonemason here by the name of Louis Camini, one eye, and he was a character. And everything that Mr. McCoy did was gospel for Louis Camini. The McCoys couldn't do wrong. So he had an old high-wheeled Cadillac, 1911 model, and he painted it bright red and named it Vesuvius. Painted the name on the door, Vesuvius. Well, I was standing on the main floor of the garage one day, and I heard this racket coming in the door, and here was Louis driving his big red Vesuvius. He unscrewed the radiator cap, and he had a big bunch of sagebrush sticking out of the neck of the radiator. And he stopped in the middle of the garage. The car was steaming and smoke rolling out from under the hood. He turned the switch off, it wouldn't stop. We finally got it over to the wall and just choked it to death against the wall. He was sitting there in the seat way up high. I ran up beside him and looked up and I said, "Louis, for heaven's sake, don't you know you're going to ruin this car?" He looked at me and he said, "I can't help it, I can't help it." And I said, "Well, what's the matter? What do you run it this way for?" "Well," he said, "let me tell you, I'm just poor Italian stonemason. I don't know anything about cars. I'm coming up that big hill out by Miller's Bridge, and all of a sudden, kapoof, she loses her water. So," he said, "I go clear back down on foot with a 5-gallon can to the river and come back up and pour in the water and go a little ways further, kapoof, she's hot again." So he said, "I go up on the hillside and I get this bunch of sagebrush and put in the radiator, and then finally I get to the top of the hill. Now," he said, "for 10 miles, all the way downhill, and all the way in the shade of this bush, she's so hot she don't know enough to stop." I'm not going to be like Louis. I know when to stop. And thank you very much. Louis is a joke.